Welcome to another special report from Catholic Family News. I'm Brian McCall, and I am happy to have another special report for you today where we're going to talk about a topic that was very dear to John Venari. John Venari was the longtime editor-in-chief of Catholic Family News, and he spent a lot of time recording some important lectures that he organized on philosophy, kind of introduction to philosophy, to metaphysics, from several really um, final great philosophy teachers who are sort of sadly not with us. The last with Dr. Bennett. But it was really an important part. And from time to time in the newspaper, we run kind of articles introducing and discussing aspects of what he used to call, and I like to call, the perennial philosophy. It's the perennial philosophy that runs all the way through history. And today we're going to be joined by Dan LeRoy, who is really a modern Renaissance man. I use that term in a good sense. He is a journalist, an author, and a teacher. And I actually think teachers make the best authors, in my experience. He teaches at a charter school in the Performing Arts Department and has also taught philosophy. And we're going to talk about his recently published book, Why We Think What We Think, The Rise and Fall of Western Thought. So welcome, Dan. Welcome to the show.
Brian, thanks so much for having me on as a guest. It's a great pleasure to be here and get to speak with you today.
Great. Yes, it's very nice to meet you. I enjoyed reading your book, which you were kind enough to have me a copy to go through, and I found it really really wonderful. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about the? I was interested in the story of the book, the story of the story, maybe Shakespeare's play within a play. But how did you come to write this book? Why did you write it? Why at this time did you think it was time for a book like this?
Well, the story of the book is that for a number of years I've taught an intro to philosophy course to high school students in my own department, the writing and publishing department here. In the course of teaching that class, a couple of things became apparent. One is there really was no great single volume introduction to Western thought. And as an author, you're always looking for the hole in the marketplace and you hope to fill it. And in particular, as a Catholic, there was not a good single volume introduction to Western thought from a Catholic perspective. So the book exists to try to check both of those boxes. But as to the why now question, because I have been teaching the class for years and have been thinking about this, one of the things that became apparent in the course of teaching this class is philosophy is a thing. I guess I knew this going in, but it's certainly affirmed after teaching the class. Philosophy is a discipline that is in disrepair. It's in disarray. It is a discipline that a lot of people will say, look, philosophy, who needs philosophy? That is a thing for people who want to waste a lot of money in higher education to study. Why do I need to know this? And that's a common complaint, but if you look at the history of Western thought, you realize there's actually a lot of validity to that complaint. Philosophy really has become, in a lot of ways, a silly discipline. It's not. It's really made itself that way. But one of the reasons that it has made itself this way in the eyes of a lot of observers is because for the past few hundred years, philosophy has really existed to serve a singular project. And this is what I think makes it relevant and what I hope makes the book relevant to people today. How do we get to this place in the world where not only is philosophy thought of as irrelevant, but how do we get to this place where we can't agree on anything? We can't agree on the simplest terms. How do we get to a place where everything is atomized in spite of the fact that we have material plenty that the ancients could never have dreamed of? How is it that everybody, and the polls tell us this, is unhappy and alone and dissatisfied? How did we get here? Well, the answer is, and that's what the book tries to tell the story of, the philosophers got us here. And if we're going to get out of that, then the only way to figure out how to get out of it is figure out how we got into it in the first place so that we can correct some of these errors at their source. So long-winded history of the book, but that's why now for this particular book?
So, again, from the title, people can guess the rise and fall of Western thought. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Dr. John Rao. He's an historian, not a philosopher per se, but a
Yes.
historian. And he has a book, a very lengthy book, which I appreciate the conciseness of your book.
Thank you.
My favorite letter from Cicero is his letter to Atticus when he says, "Dear Atticus, if I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter."
Exactly.
But
Exactly.
but anyway, John's theory throughout that incredible history of the world, basically book, is that there's really been running through history kind of an ongoing war between two camps, which he sort of calls the Sophists and the Socratics, or the true philosophers. And kind of his view of how we got where we are is there's just been this ongoing war that we're living in, where the Sophists have basically triumphed. So, from your kind of view of thousands of years of history, what do you think of that theory? Do you think there has just basically been this war, or do you think that's not really the right way to think about it?
No, I happen, even though it's not mentioned in this book, I happen to agree with
Mhm.
that theory. There are ancient roots to a lot of the modern malaise that we see, and the Sophists deserve credit for being the source of a lot of the problems that we have now. Sophists meaning people who argue for the sake of argument. It doesn't matter what's true, it doesn't matter who's right, it's who makes the best case for themselves. And the Socratics, meanwhile, and one of the things that I think is important to say is that the roots of the greatest Catholic philosophy do go back to the ancients. They do go back to Socrates, they go back to his student Plato, and they go back to his student, in particular, Aristotle. And if we could define the difference between the Sophists and the Socratics do care about truth. They believe that there is objective truth, and that not only is there objective truth, but it is in the nature of man to seek after that objective truth. In fact, if we don't seek after that objective truth, we're not fulfilling our purpose in life, and therefore we're never truly going to be happy. And one of the things about a through line, I guess you could say, that runs from Socrates all the way through to the modern Thomists, the disciples of St. Thomas Aquinas, is they understand that we're unhappy today in large part because we are not fulfilling that destiny. From Socrates on, the thinking has been man is created as a rational being. He has the power of reason. His job is to use that power of reason to seek the truth, the ultimate truth. Seeking knowledge for the sake of knowledge is good. Knowledge is a thing that has desirable properties just apart from whatever it can do for us. The seeking of knowledge is part of the human condition. We're obligated to do this, or again, we're never going to be happy. Why are we unhappy today? Part of the reason goes right back to that argument that you just quoted, because we don't know what our telos is, the Greek word for purpose. We don't know why we're here. We don't know that we are, or we've forgotten, maybe is the better way to say it. We've forgotten that we have a purpose. The purpose is to seek the truth. Of course, as Catholics and Christians, we believe that that ultimate truth that we're seeking after is knowledge of the one who created us. But even before there were Catholics and Christians, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they had the same idea. And the great Christian philosophers adopted that idea. St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas took that idea. Abandoning that idea, which runs from classical Greece all the way through the medieval period, that is the single biggest mistake, not just in Western thought, probably in Western history. And if to, I guess, recap the idea I was just mentioning of why this book now, we can't fix that error until we go back to the source and figure out why did we abandon this Thomistic philosophy, which kind of perfected all of the classical stuff that came before it. Why did we get rid of this? And there is an answer to why we get rid of it. That's the fall part of this book. And the fall takes up a good chunk of years. But the nice thing is that the fall part of it doesn't take up as many years as the rise of it. And the rise begins in Greece and it continues again through the medieval period. And for about 1,500 years, if you said philosophy, you really meant Catholic philosophy. That, in a lot of cases, is what we were talking about. So, going back to where the road diverged and how can we get back to that point and take the right path this time? That's really the prescription of this book.
I mean, you're absolutely right. The ancients, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, didn't have revelation, but I always find just one of my favorite passages about St. Paul is what shows that the Greeks, even though they didn't know, they knew what they didn't know, and they knew there was something more. Because remember, St. Paul, our viewers may remember, I've told the story before. When he comes to Athens, he speaks to them, and he announces, he says, "On my way up here, I passed one of your pagan shrines to the unknown God, and I have come here today to tell you who this unknown God is." And that's really, to me, sums up both the beauty of the ability of ancient reason, but its own known limits. That they sort of could sense there's something more, that there must be something more, but they didn't know what it was, and they were waiting for it. Unfortunately, the Platonists didn't have the greatest reaction to St. Paul, or most of them, but there was that sense of what was waiting. But
Well,
it's interesting. Oh, sorry.
yeah. No, I'm sorry. That I was just going to say that
Yeah.
is a great point in
Yeah.
particular, because what you're talking about is a certain kind of humility
Hmm.
that the ancients, and all the way again through the scholastics in the medieval period, that they all possessed. The mark, the hallmark of the modern era in philosophy is to take that question about the unknown God and to say, we don't need to know this. That's not a thing we can prove, and therefore let's just write it out of the equation. And as modernity progressed, the prescriptions against trying to address any of this became more and more strict. We draw a fence around what we can know for sure and what we can't know for sure. God is on the outside of that fence. The box gets smaller and smaller. That's a great paradox of modern
Yes.
philosophy. The more we progress, the less we realize that we actually know without any recourse to God.
Absolutely. And again, if you're maybe just joining us in this video, we're talking about an excellent book that has been recently published. How we know how I'm sorry why this is thinking my expression, why we know what we know, which is the rise and fall of Western thought. It has been published by Sophia Institute Press, and there's a link in this video to where you can purchase it through the CFN affiliate program, which will give you not only access to the book, but a discount, a special discount for our viewers who watch this show. But I want to pick up on one of the things you said there about the humility of the ancients. Again, Socrates, certainly known for his humility, right? He really, his whole point was he knew he didn't know things. But one of the things that clearly comes through from your argument is one of the flaw, maybe the original sin of modern philosophy, is this great skepticism. And I want to talk a little bit about what's the difference between the Socratic skepticism, the questioning of Socrates, the whole dialectic method that he used of questioning, and from the skepticism of today, which is essentially, I've had several children go through college. They all really interested in philosophy. They take a philosophy course. They come home really disappointed because they say, every time I try to argue something, I get shut down and told, well, we can never know, so just be quiet. That the idea of essentially they've turned into an absolute principle that we can't absolutely know anything. What's the difference?
It's a great question, and it goes back to something that we were just talking about a moment ago, which is it's Socrates, as you said. The famous quote is, "The only thing I know for sure is that I don't know anything for sure,"
Right.
or some version of that. The difference between Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the great classical philosophers, the great Christian philosophers, they believed that, to use that old catchphrase from TV, that the truth is out there and it is our job to find it. The skeptics, uh, and from ancient times, we have the actual philosophical skeptics, capital S, and then we have also the sophists, who are very, very similarly minded. The difference is they don't believe the truth is out there, or they believe that if it is out there, there's no way that we're ever going to find it. And therefore, the best we can do is say, well, look, everybody's truth is their truth. I got my truth. You got your truth. We've all heard people, maybe who don't know anything about philosophy, advance a variation on that argument. And the big difference is to say that the truth is out there and we're still working toward finding it versus, yeah, there is no truth, or it's not really our job to seek that absolute truth because it's unknowable. That is a huge, huge difference. And clearly we are living right now through this idea of multiple truths, the idea that objective truth is a fallacy or a waste of time, the idea that whatever anybody says is the truth. I feel this, therefore it must be true. And if it's not true for you, that's okay, because again, to each his own. That's the big difference. And one of the things that is touched on in the book, especially in the modern part of it, is this is where we see the roots of the discussion that we're now having in some quarters about the end of liberalism. To quote a great book by the Notre Dame professor Patrick Deneen, why are we now talking about the idea that, hey, maybe liberalism as we know it, classical liberalism, has run its course? And part of the reason for that, again, is this very, very old argument about, look, there either is an objective truth that we're seeking after that we all agree upon, or there isn't one. But clearly society, the society in which we live in, the classical liberal society, it's not built to accommodate the idea that anybody can come up with their own truth and they're all good. It just doesn't work. And that's why we see ourselves running up against this wall in our discussions, where people are starting to say, maybe this great experiment, which is hundreds of years in duration and has given us the America in particular that we know and in a lot of cases love, maybe we've gone about as far as we can with that. Now, I'm not really taking a position on that issue, but in terms of the roots of that argument, you can trace it right back to this question you're asking, the difference between the Socratic notion of truth and the skeptical, the sophistic notion of truth. They can't both be true. And if the skeptical and the sophistic version of truth is true, then, as I read somewhere this morning, diversity then becomes not something to celebrate, it becomes corrosive. It is the thing that is going to, it's going to disassemble eventually these component parts of the republic in which we live.
You're absolutely right. And I think the early 20th century and the late 19th century, the great popes warned us of this. They essentially said liberalism is telling you a lie. We're giving you more freedom, more ability to think, supposedly liberalism, but it actually will end with less freedom of thought, less discussion. And I think that's one of the ironies. And one of the people, if you try to bring out St. Thomas or even to some extent Aristotle, people say, oh, you're just trying to shut down debate. You're trying to impose your views on people, where anyone who's read any of Plato's dialogues, St. Thomas, his Summa or his Summa contra Gentiles, it's actually, when you believe there is a truth, it's a great stimulus of debate. Because if you believe there's truth out there, the way to find it is actually debating and discussing ideas with people to refine through that method. So it really, at least to me, is this irony of liberalism, that they say everybody do each his own is going to give more freedom. It actually gives less freedom for debate and discussion. I don't know. Would you agree?
There's so many ironies in the book. It's all, I didn't track them, but it's almost like, okay, the irony per page count is, I think it's pretty close to 1 to 1. And one of the big ones is something that you just said. This idea that having recourse to Aristotle, for example, having recourse to St. Thomas Aquinas means you're shutting down debate. No, actually, it goes the other way. One of the great misconceptions is that we don't we shouldn't bring up Aristotle. We shouldn't bring up Aquinas. We shouldn't bring up these ancient philosophers, in particular the ancient Christian philosophers or the medieval Christian philosophers, because everybody knows, man, that science came along and disproved all that. That's absolutely not the case. Talking about shutting down debate, nobody disproved the stuff that Aquinas wrote in those 2 volumes that you mentioned. No one disproved it. They just abandoned it. They just shut down the debate because they didn't want to hear any of this stuff, because it was inconvenient to their project of liberating the individual, which is, again, the story of the second half of this book. The project of the philosophers is the project of liberating the individual from every possible constraint from God. You don't owe anything to the church. You don't owe anything to your family. You don't owe anything to your kids. You don't owe anything to your community. And we see that even when we get into the modern part of this. A philosopher who's beloved of a lot of Americans, at least the ones who know him, is the British philosopher John Locke. And it is true, without John Locke, we don't have a Declaration of Independence. We probably don't have a republic because of the way in which he influenced the views of Thomas Jefferson, among the other founders. So if you like the America that we live in, then you definitely owe a lot to John Locke. But the underbelly of this philosophy, and we should also point out John Locke is not really a friend to Catholics, but that's
his essay on toleration, he makes clear toleration does not include Catholics. But he calls fanatics, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the other part of this is, if you do a little more reading into Locke's signature works, is his goal is to make all alliances, all commitments voluntary. So if you decide that you are going to, for example, spend time with an elderly relative who's maybe on their last legs, you're not doing that because you owe them anything, even if it's a parent. You're doing it purely out of voluntary reasons. You're only doing it because you're a great person, a great individual. You don't have to stay in a marriage that is not working because, again, you stay because it's voluntary, not because you are actually making a commitment to some higher power, higher purpose. So if you look closely at Locke's philosophy, there's a lot of stuff in there that a lot of people don't realize, that, yes, it produced the America that we live in. That's great in a lot of ways. It has also produced the America we now live in which all of these commitments that used to be thought of as obligations are voluntary. You only do it because you feel like it. And if you don't feel like it, then that's okay. That's entirely your decision.
Well, my view on John Locke is essentially a paraphrase of Augustine's view on the Donatist heretics. He says, because there is some good things in John Locke, but I would say anything that's good in John Locke is not his own. It's something he's taken from an earlier tradition, and what is his own is actually not good. But that's my own way.
Locke had some remarkable views. If you talk about his views about the disabled, his views of the unborn, it's not kind-hearted, fuzzy stuff. It's really, it might be fuzzy, but not in that way.
Not in that way, right? Well, I'm going to ask you what I will state up front is an unfair question. It's like asking someone, what is the critical moment of the fall of the Roman Empire? Because as you show through your whole book, this decline, as with the fall of the Roman Empire, is not precisely at a certain period. But again, it often is a helpful question. Is it the 474? Is it 430? Is it Attila, or is it the Visigoths, etc.? So in philosophy, I want to ask you the same thing. There's a lot of, as my friend Christopher Arra says, villains du jour through your history of the decline. But if you had to, and again, I get they all are interconnected, it's a process, but if you had to pick one, who do you think is sort of the worst moment, or the moment where the fall is really set in motion? By which of these kind of problematic philosophers?
This is going to make a lot of people mad, because the standard answer here would be Rene Descartes, with his separation of the mind and body. I'm going to make the case, and I do have some backup here. It's not just me. This is an argument. It's not original to me. It has been advanced, among other people, by non-Catholics like Richard Weaver, by current Catholic philosophers. Ed Feser is one of those. But the villain in the tale, it saddens me to say, is Catholic. Unfortunately, from my perspective, it is William of Ockham. And the reason for this, and Ockham, for those people who may say Ockham, where have I heard that name before? He didn't actually name this, and it's a principle which he borrowed, to go back to what you were just saying about John Locke. This is a borrowed principle, Occam's razor. The idea that the simplest explanation for something is usually best. If we've heard Occam's name, that's generally where it's been heard. But what a lot of people don't realize about Occam is that he, perhaps more than anyone in his era, and here we're talking about the early 1300s, he looks at the work of the scholastics, Aquinas in particular, but there are others, and he looks at the system that Aquinas has created, which is a very understandable way of perceiving the world. The idea that God created a world that is knowable to us, maybe not in its entirety to human beings, but it is a world that we can trust our knowledge of because God made it, and he made it in part so that we can understand it to the extent that we can as human beings. Occam looks at all this stuff and says, look, you're claiming too much for man. Man is not, you're trying to put man, in other words, on the same level as God. And you are claiming that man can know things about God that it's impossible to know. God could do anything. If God, to use the famous phrase, if God wanted to make us hate him, well, then he would, and we wouldn't know any different. And Occam is a fascinating character. He is a guy who, on the one hand, works against Thomistic philosophy and scholastic philosophy because he believes, again, that they're claiming too much for man. So in one sense, he's doing it because he's trying to preserve the sovereignty of God. And you can say, okay, that's a noble thing to do. On the other hand, Occam is, for a lot of people, he's the proto-Protestant. He is a big critic of the church. He's a critic of the papacy. It's not a big surprise that he would eventually be excommunicated, in part because of these views that he had. And Occam is not the guy who did it himself. It didn't happen overnight. Other people would kind of pick up this mantle. But where did it start? Where did we start to undermine this work that Aquinas in particular did, which for me and for other people is sort of the high point of Western philosophy? Where did that start to go wrong? It started to go wrong, in my view, with Occam. And it makes me, it should make anybody sad to say, who's the villain of the tale? Well, the villain is actually another Catholic friar, and yet in my telling of the story, that is where I have to assign a lot of the blame.
No, and I do want to highlight, you mentioned, that was a book that was really seminal for me. A thinker in my early formation of thought is Richard Weaver.
Yes.
One you don't hear much about today, but that he really was the first to introduce me to Occam and to see things in this context. I'm not sure. I hope his book is still in print.
I believe it is. In fact, there's a new version. Ideas have
tons going on.
I think it's a fairly recent edition of it.
Oh, good.
Which even in that edition, I think came out about 10 years ago. Even in the introduction, and I'm trying to remember who said it, but they're like, hey, listen, if we're trying to pin the fall of Western thought on William of Ockham, that seems a little bit ridiculous. Like, one guy shouldn't get that much credit, and he's right about that. But it's got to start somewhere, and Ockham opens the door to a lot of things. You could make the argument: would the Protestant Reformation have happened in the way it did if not for some of the ideas that Occam advanced? Never know, but he was certainly tracking along some of the same paths that Martin Luther would pick up a couple of centuries later.
Well, maybe I got a little debate going here, because as I said, I agree with you. I've thought that for a long time, and when I've talked to people who say Descartes or Hume, I've always said, yeah, well, first came Occam. But there's another candidate that I've been thinking about recently, and I can't recall if you mentioned in the book. You might, but that's Sigier of Brabant, who was a kind of a sparring partner of Aquinas, and his idea, Occam's, as you mentioned, essentially the voluntarist versus the intellectualist. But his is there's two truths. And again, I've been kind of thinking lately, does it go a little bit before Occam to CJ, who sort of said, well, there's two truths, something can be true according to faith, but something according to reason. So I don't know. I'll throw that. What's your reaction?
Well, first the mea culpa, because he is not mentioned in the book, and probably should be. But the other part of that might be that this is an idea. One thing the book does go into is the Muslim and to some extent the Jewish roots of incorporating Aristotle into the three big monotheistic faiths. And the Muslims and the Jews kind of got there first before the Christians. They had access to Aristotle's work. And one of the things that is a constant really throughout that chapter on the Muslim philosophers of the pre-scholastic period is that same idea that there are multiple truths. There's a truth of the philosophers, and then there's a truth of the regular people. And so I think this idea of having multiple truths, I think it does talk about it in the book a little bit, that this opens the door to some problems, because if you're going to say, well, listen, the idea of God, that's what we tell regular people. In fact, I'm trying to remember who did this, and I'm blanking on it, but it's an idea, I think it was adopted by more than one philosopher of this period. We tell people that God is the way he is, that he's a old man with a beard. We tell people this because they're stupid. And the truth of the philosophers, well, that's for the smart people to understand. We're not that dumb. So it really opens up this schism potentially where you're saying, again, the two truths, the truth for those of us who are the elect, the smart, and then for everybody else, the great unwashed. And that it sounds like that is similar maybe to what you're talking about here. And if so, I see the issues with it. In fact, it's not me. People were seeing the issues with this all the way back in the 11 and 1200s. That's one reason that Aristotle ultimately isn't accepted in Islam in particular, but also by Judaism because of that kind of thinking.
And you're right, that's another one of those ironies you spoke about, that but for those authors and the Islamic and Jewish authors, the 13th century would not have had the texts of Aristotle because they, as you said, preserved them. But then ironically, those who preserved it for the West abandoned it is one of those ironies. But no, very, very true. Well, in our remaining time, I'd like to turn us, your book is obviously focused on the past. It's telling a story. But I'd like to get your views on the next story. So what's it mean? We've had this great fall. Occam, Descartes, Hume, Kant, Locke, Hobbes. They've led us down this Nietzsche, this bad path. Are we stuck? Are we sort of inevitably just it's all lost? It reminded me this thought. I once heard a sermon by a great now deceased Jesuit who was really a Jesuit, a real Jesuit, unlike the modern ones. Father Hugh Thwaites, wonderful priest in England. He preached a sermon there about, he said, when the Israelites lost the temple and the temple was destroyed, and they eventually came back, but it wasn't the same. They weren't able to rebuild the temple the way it had been under Solomon because they had sort of fallen and it was difficult to ever go back. So is that where we are in philosophy? Do you think it's sort of, the pieces are broken? Or is it a message of hope that with these corrections we can get back on track? What's your view of the future?
Well, one of the things that I didn't really know or didn't know fully going into the writing of this book, having taught philosophy and having taught it really from a secular perspective, if you look at the 20th century philosophy, it's not very heartening. We find that things get more and more ridiculous. Again, the box gets smaller and smaller. The only philosophies that really gain any traction are the philosophies that essentially try to destroy philosophy. You have a guy like Derrida, who his whole idea of deconstruction essentially tells us that anything you say, anything you write, is pretty much open to interpretation. There is no truth. Even if you think you're writing and speaking truth, it is subject to someone else's deconstruction, which essentially is another way of saying words are meaningless. So the way that I've always taught the course, that's kind of where we end up, and it's not a super hopeful place. If you want to end up with living philosophers, you usually end up talking about someone like Peter Singer, whose views I believe are fairly well known, if not orthodox. But in writing the book, I realized that there's a story that never gets told, because most of the histories of philosophy are secular histories. And that's the story of the great Catholic philosophers of the last 150 years, starting with Pope Leo XIII, who writes a couple of encyclicals, which are really, really fundamental. One of them tells us that, look, we have to go back to the angelic doctor, St. Thomas Aquinas. That is the only way out of, this is in the late 19th century, and people are already saying the same things then that they're saying today. How are we going to get out of this mess? And Pope Leo's idea is the only way we get out of it is we go back to the future. We go back to St. Thomas Aquinas. And if you look at the great philosophers who followed him, including some popes who never get any credit for being philosophers, that would include St. John Paul II. If you look at the two last philosophers who are in the book, in particular, Gertrude Anscombe, who is deceased, and Alasdair MacIntyre, who is the only living philosopher who's talked about, you see that this idea that Pope Leo talked about, we have to reclaim this Thomistic legacy. That's the through line that has run through Catholic thought for the last 150 years, and it's produced in the person of Gertrude Anscombe what a lot of people would say, hey, this is the greatest female philosopher who has ever lived. She is a formidable intellect. She was also a Thomist. She was able to take Thomistic philosophy and add it to some of the more modern strains that she had studied. McIntyre's the same way. This is a guy who cast about. He was a Marxist. He was a modernist in the true sense. And then he writes a book in 1981 called After Virtue. And in that book, he looks back and he says, maybe there is something to this Aristotelian moral philosophy that has been lost in the modern world. In the course of writing this book, he becomes a Thomist, and eventually he becomes a Catholic. So it's a great reminder, his story, which is the final story in the book. It is possible to reclaim these traditional Catholic philosophical roots, and in doing so, the thing I like best about McIntyre's story is also one of the reasons for writing this book, which is we talk a lot, or we should talk a lot, about, okay, how are we going to convince people in this very atomized and certainly atheistic, or at least skeptical world? How are we going to convince people of the truth of the faith? And one vehicle that has been abandoned as a possible tool to start that conversation is philosophy. And the conversion of Alasdair MacIntyre in particular, and a similar thing happened to Gertrude Anscombe, it reminds us that philosophy can actually be a tool for conversion, that intelligent people, on reading the work in particular of St. Thomas Aquinas, can not only be convinced of his philosophical arguments, but can be convinced of his worldview as well. And look, Alasdair MacIntyre is a guy who's a hell of a lot smarter than I am. He's a hell of a lot smarter than a lot of people. If it can happen to a guy that smart, it can happen to anyone.
Absolutely. And I will let those of our viewers who are subscribers to our monthly newspaper, interestingly, coincidentally, or providentially, we are reprinting, starting with the March edition, and it'll be serialized over a few months, the encyclical that Dan just referred to, Pastor Eternus, the encyclical, Pater Eternus. Wait, sorry, yes.
There's a lot of encyclicals.
Exactly. So the one on St. Thomas Aquinas, sorry, Pastor Eternus is Vatican I. The one on the angelic doctor, on the return, go back to Thomas. So that encyclical we were just talking about is actually appearing, the first part of it, in our March paper, which is just published a few days ago. So if you want to read that, you'll be able to see that serialized in the paper. But I'm glad you mentioned McIntyre, because you're right. There is an interesting story for all the decline of the 20th century. There is a story, and again, I'd add to your list G.K. Chesterton, another example.
Absolutely.
of people who philosophy can lead to truth and to conversion. But it's interesting. I'd like to end with talking about McIntyre because I read him and things he wrote after virtue, and I debate: is he positive or negative? Is he hopeful or not? Because sometimes you can read him as, particularly his idea of tradition constituted rationality. That sometimes you could read it, well, we just can't talk to these people, right? You can only talk within a tradition, and how to talk. You can't talk kind of across traditions. But then you're right. Other times I read him as more hopeful. I don't. How do you? What's your take on it?
I mean, I think his synthesis of
Mhm.
Aristotle and Aquinas with some of these more modern philosophers, these philosophical traditions that he grew up in the first part of the 20th century.
Yes.
There's, in particular, the analytic philosophy, which is a commonality that he has with Anscombe. There's a lot of moving parts there, and I agree with you that sometimes, I mean, if you look at the very famous last paragraph of After Virtue, where he talks
Yes.
about, look, we're basically waiting for another Saint Benedict. Uh, just in that one paragraph, you can sort of construe that in one of two ways. Is that a hopeful thing? I mean, he really is saying, like, hey, it's kind of late. The barbarians, they're here, and we're going to have to decide what to do. Is it a hopeful thing to say that, to use that example of Saint Benedict, a very different Saint Benedict, as he puts it? Is that person going to be someone who, you hear people talk about the Benedict option, uh, and how in some people's view, this is a positive thing. We are saying we are going to come together in these communities. They're going to be intentional. We're going to develop them to preserve the faith because we see what's coming. And then there are other people who perceive that as, well, you guys are just bowing out. You're giving up on the world. You're trying to retreat behind the walls, and that's defeatist. So I think that very famous graph from McIntyre sort of summarized. I think some of it is in the eye of the beholder, especially because, and maybe this is convenient for me because it's the end of my book, I'm trying to look at it in a hopeful way, that this is a guy who was persuaded on the strength of, in the view of many people, the greatest Catholic philosopher and maybe the greatest philosopher who ever lived. This got past the Marxism, it got past the analytic philosophy, it got through all of these modern filters, and it struck him in a deeper place. I'm going to view it as, this is a sign that's hopeful. I'm going to view it as a sign that it has to remind us, to go back to the very beginning of this discussion. Somebody asked me, hey, isn't philosophy is just for smart people, right? And my answer to that is like, hey, look what leaving philosophy for the smart people has done over the last few hundred years. It's not for the smart people. It's maybe made itself that way, but it is our job as faithful Catholics. We got to reclaim it. To go back to the words of that encyclical of Pope Leo XIII, it's not an optional thing. It's our job. And nobody likes to hear about evangelization because, it's hard work and people are mean to us. But I guess, to try to put a cap on that question, I'm viewing philosophy and knowing Catholic philosophy, as a form of evangelization. It is our responsibility as Catholics to know what the tradition is. And if you can't convince someone through we'll say, a faith-based argument purely, maybe this is another avenue. Because again, if you go back to the work of Aquinas, one thing that might surprise a lot of people is he wasn't disproven. Science didn't blow all this stuff out of the water. It didn't blow Aristotle out of the water either. And a lot of people believe that. Part of the misconception that it's our job to correct is that one. So if you can't, maybe I'll summarize it this way. If you can't get somebody to come to Mass with you this weekend, as you should probably try to do, maybe have a philosophical discussion with them and see if you can reach them on that level.
Absolutely. Well, I do want to emphasize for our listeners and viewers, and it should come through just speaking with you, Dan, that I would not hesitate to buy this book because of sort of what you're saying, thinking, oh, this is for smart people. This will be hard to understand. It's going to be big, scary words, and and things I beyond me. Absolutely not. I mean, this is a book. You can tell that you've taught high school students. You have a gift for explaining things, things that have been taught by great minds, greater than both of us, certainly, but in a way that anyone who can read can pick up this book and understand it. So I think that
compliment.
It's really very true, and I really want to encourage our viewers. Don't think that, and a lot of people think, oh, like you said, philosophy, this is for smart people. Well, I'm going to tell you, don't doubt yourself, because I had a student just last week who asked me, what's the most important thing you learned? Because it's my undergraduate degree, I went to Yale. So what's the greatest thing you learned at Yale? I said, you know what the greatest thing I learned, the most important thing I learned 30 years ago there, is there's a lot of stupid smart people in the world. And don't let smart people, quote unquote, smart people intimidate you, because they're really the sophists of our age. And God gave you an intellect that is capable and is made for truth. And so if it's presented to you in a clear, simple way, you'll be able to understand it. God didn't make
it better than that.
Exactly. So thank you for your efforts in writing this book and making it available for people. Again, before we go, it's Sophia Institute Press. There's a direct link to it. I notice it's actually on sale right now. It's $17.99. So for the price of probably 2 Starbucks coffees, which you shouldn't drink anyway because they're terrible, you can buy an entire history of philosophy. Wonderful book. There's a link there where you also get a CFN discount through a discount code. But please go over to Sophia Press and take a look at this book. So thank you for joining us today, and it's been really a pleasure to get to know you, to speak with you, and perhaps we can have you back to debate another topic someday.
I would love to come back. I want to thank you for having me on the show. Just to go back to the beginnings of the conversation, you find anybody who wants to talk about philosophy, you should probably take them up on it. It is not a thing that everyone is necessarily willing to do. It's a great pleasure to be here and get to have such a great discussion with you about this subject today.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you next time. God bless.